Hello everyone, video 6 in our series on getting .NET 6, Angular 13, and VS Code all working together to really try to get like a business level website together in the end. So in this video we really want to just talk about setting up a SQL Server database, and we're going to be using the Entity Framework, which is how we're going to be communicating back and forth with our database. And you can use the Entity Framework with some other database technologies, but we're going to be using the local DB, which is free. It's fine for all this testing. You're not having to pay for a SQL Server license or anything like that. But in the end, with the functionality that we're going to write, you'd have to either use SQL Server Express, which I think the limitations are maybe a 10 gig database or something like that, or actually have a real SQL Server license. There are developer licenses and stuff, but if you're working for a company, you should definitely have the licenses available for SQL Server. If you really wanted to go with a different technology, I'm sure there are going to be some better videos out there, but for the most part, it's just going to be a change of a connection string and how we initially set up the database. And from there, if you're following the video as we create our tables and stuff like that, it should all be the same. So as long as it's a relational database, that is. All right, I think we're ready to get started. I'm going to hop over to Visual Studio Code. We're not actually going to be doing too much with the database directly. If you don't have something that can look at a SQL Server database, I'd recommend you just Google Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. It used to cost money or be part of the actual paid licenses, but it's been free now for quite a while. And in addition to that, they also have I believe it's called Azure DevOps Studio now. And in that, you can go ahead and connect to your databases and view them as well. Again, you shouldn't really need to, assuming that there's no problems going on, but I would definitely recommend having a tool like that handy. Sometimes it's just a little easier working and seeing the data in one of those tools instead of trying to use commands or something like that. All right, to get started, we're just going to start with creating a folder called data. Now, this isn't required that it's called data or anything like that. It's just a preference of mine. And inside of that data folder, we're going to make a new folder as well. And we're going to call this something along the lines of the database name that we're going to create. So for this particular demo, I'm going to call our database tutorial. And so just know that my database will be called tutorial. And it's not necessarily set to do that by me naming this folder that. It's just going to be, I just want the name of this folder to match what I know I'm going to set our database name as. So it's not actually what's driving the name of it. That's just a convention for us. And inside of the tutorial folder, once again, I'm going to create another folder. Again, all this nesting in different folders isn't necessary, but I especially like to do this because I normally end up building websites that maybe they have more than one database involved in them. And I like to go ahead and just have those separated out instead of having it all mixed up together. So again, our database, we're going to call it tutorial, and then I'm going to add a new folder under it, and I'm going to call it schema. Maybe you want to call it entities, or maybe you want to call it tables or something like that. I've always gone with just the name schema. And so now we have the data folder with the tutorial folder inside of it and the schema folder inside of that. Now before we start creating tables, we're going to go back up to our tutorial folder and we're going to right click on it and we're going to do a new file, and I'm going to call this file tutorial context.cs. And if you've been watching the other videos, you know I'm just doing all of this off the cuff. I don't really have a script planned out. I don't even know what table names I'm going to use at this point. So if you see some errors along the way, just bear with me. We're doing this together. So what's the namespace? The namespace is basically that that folder structure that we have. So it's starting with the name of our project, and then we have data, and then we have tutorial, and that is where this file lives. And then we're going to go ahead and make a class. We'll do public class tutorial context, and we are going to be using a parent class here, and that class is it's going to be the DB context, and hopefully we get some IntelliSense here. Maybe it's DB context. We're going to leave it with the lowercase d, but obviously one of the first things that we have to do is we haven't referenced any sort of a library or anything to be able to actually have access to this DB context database. So what we can do is, obviously if you're using another IDE, a lot of them have built-in NuGet package managers. You're just going to want to go to that. If you're here with me in VS Code in the terminal window, you might not have access to anything that can do that. So I'm going to right click on our website folder. I'm going to go to open an integrated terminal. And as always, you can do that from any terminal. I just like it because it takes me directly to the correct folder path here. So to add a package, it's sort of like the npm install commands that we were doing before, or npm commands, but in this case, we can do .NET add package, and the package that we want is going to be, let's see, it's going to be Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. And I'm going to go ahead and add that. Unauthorized. Now, you can see if you looked at my logs quickly enough here that I'm connected to private repositories, and I need to set up some specific access. It looks like my token has expired, of course, now that I'm doing a tutorial video. So give me one moment. I'm going to pause this video, reauthorize myself to my private repository. This isn't something that you should face unless you have your own private repositories. And in that case, you should already know what to do there. So 1 second and we'll be right back. Okay, we're continuing on with part 2 now that I've got my authentication issue sorted out. If you went ahead and executed the command like we had initially typed it out, .NET add package Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. Apparently I had a typo in there. We'll just go ahead and run that. And you'll see that the package was added for the version of the .NET SDK that we got, which is 6.0.4, and that's correct. The other thing we'll want to reference is the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.Design. The tools are going to need that when we're running different database updates and migrations and stuff. Let's go ahead and add that. And then what we'll do is, in order for those tools and everything to work, okay, it says it there. I think that's all we need to have for now. You can see that this is where the packages are. Technically, we could just type in a package name and the version. And if we were to save our files and do our project file and do a .NET restore, it would kind of do the same thing as what we just kind of did through the command line there. So now that we have the two libraries from Microsoft that we're going to be using for the Entity Framework, like I said, that's going to be our connectivity to the database. Now if we go back to our file and we do the yellow light bulb, or we do the control with the period for the IntelliSense options, you can see that now we have using Microsoft Entity Framework Core there. And if we save that, we've got all of the stuff that's implemented in this DB context, we've got it in ours as well. And that's going to be, pretty much I'd say the majority of everything that we would use for the connectivity. The only things we actually need to do are, one, we need to be able to pass in the options for um, our, let's say, connection strings and everything. And there's conventions in place that we're just going to leave alone. So in order to do this, what we need to do is we need to add a constructor for our tutorial context. And it needs to be able to accept a parameter with the DB context options. And the options are going to be of the type of the database that context that we made here for our class. So I'm just going to type in our class there. Okay. And then we'll just accept a parameter like options, for instance. It doesn't really matter what they're named. And then what we have to do is we have to be able to pass those options into the DB context that we have right here. In order to do that, you're going to write just base, which is the base class. And the parameter that the base class accepts is options here, which is the DB context options. Now, it's possible that the DB context has a constructor that maybe accepts, okay, like here, there's one that accepts nothing that's protected. So I think pretty much the way that I'm seeing it is they're always wanting the options to be passed in. And that's perfectly fine. Those options are coming from, again, some code that we haven't written that's kind of all behind the scenes. But what it's doing is it's reading your app context, or I'm sorry, your app settings.json files, again, the appropriate one, and it's going to try to pull out the connection string based off the convention that's in place. And we'll get to the convention here once we need to add our connection string. The other thing is we're going to go ahead and add a constructor that doesn't take any parameters. And I don't remember if I normally need that. Maybe I've done it for mocking up the database before, but I don't normally end up needing to do that these days. It might just be something I do out of a habit. But continuing on, so I'm going to go ahead and get us to override a couple of methods that are inside, or functions, that are inside the DB context right now. So these are pretty much in place for us to do this with. So we're going to do a protected override, doesn't return anything, and the one we're going to do is the on model creating, and it accepts the model builder, and we'll just say builder. Okay, we're good there. Is there anything else we want to do here? No, I think that's pretty much it for now. We're going to come back to this method here in just a couple of minutes after we've defined the first table. And saying that, I think we're actually ready to go ahead and write our first table. So if we come back to our schema folder, and we go ahead and right click on that and we do new file, the file that we're going to create, well, I guess we've used testing a lot, but I'm getting a little tired of that. Let's just write, maybe we'll do something like, I don't want to use the news keyword, but let's do something like foods.cs. So again, let's go ahead and, what namespace are we in? Well, the namespace is, again, the project, data, tutorial, and now this is the first one that's under the schema. And then we'll do a public class, and we're going to go with foods. And I'm going to go ahead and rename that because I tend not to name my tables with the plural of S. So now we've got a public class food, and if you saw, I had renamed the file to food.cs. So make sure you do that so they match. the next thing we want to do, and we'll probably extract, most of this away into, well, let's go ahead and do it right now. So we'll do public class, and what we're just going to call this is our base entity. And the whole point of this base entity is just going to be to add properties into the rest of our, so to add columns into the rest of our tables that we pretty much want over and over in all of the tables. Now I have my preferences here, and this is the way that I do it. You don't have to necessarily add all of these properties if you don't plan on using them, but I'm just going to go ahead and give you the list that I can think of right now that I normally use on my base entity. So obviously it's not something I write a lot. I write the base entity one time and I normally don't see it again. So we'll do public int ID. And this is going to be the ID of, well, it's going to, first of all, it's going to be a column in our database table named ID. But we wanted to actually have some functionality, and we wanted to auto increment and stuff like that. So we'll go ahead and we need to get the annotations namespace. So we'll do the control period, and we will go ahead and import that namespace. So now we're using the data annotations here, and you can see we've defined it as the key. So what does the key mean? Well, it can mean different things slightly, but the way that we're going to use it here is to say that it's the primary key of our table. And by being the primary key, it's going to have like the most indexing and quick reference kind of stuff to it, and we want that to be a number. Now, some people like to use GUIDs and stuff, and that's perfectly fine as well. I prefer numbers. I like to see the order of things. And that's just a preference to me. I do look at the data quite a bit on the SQL side of it, and I like to pass the numbers into my web APIs instead of GUIDs and stuff like that. So your preference, your project, but go ahead and get that in place. Anything else? Okay, so normally, because I normally have users logging in and have users involved in stuff like this, I normally make a couple more columns for tracking this kind of stuff. So we'll just go ahead and set those up and assume that, if you're making this kind of a website, you're going to want to keep track of users touching these tables in some way. So we'll do a public string, and we're going to do modified by, and we'll give it a getter and a setter. And we're doing a nullable string there. Mostly Entity Framework Core wouldn't really care or not if that's there, but it is an optional field. It's not always going to be populated. And we just want .NET to, for the sake of, all the IntelliSense and everything else, to know that it can be null sometimes. All right, next thing we want is a date time offset. Again, this isn't always going to be populated, so we're just going to put these question marks, and that's what I meant by making it nullable. That just means it's not always going to have a value. So, and I'll give you a quick example of that in just a second, but let's finish writing this one down, and I call this the modified date. Now, just to real quickly touch on this nullable thing again, you're probably familiar with booleans, right? So we'll just do a bool. And you know that the only values for boolean can be true or false, and we'll just say this is some flag. Okay, so if we did a getter or a setter, anytime a class, that used this property was there, well, the default value is going to be false. But maybe, and some people used to write a third state, and write their own boolean classes basically, but you don't really have to do something like that anymore, and I wouldn't normally have recommended it outside of limited scenarios anyway, but what we can do is we're going to say that this boolean, we're going to put the question mark after the type, and now what that means is in addition to, and because I haven't set any value in it, it will be null until something sets it to true or false. Whereas without it, it was going to default to the value of false. So again, I wouldn't normally recommend using that sort of logic for booleans and the null values for them. But because this is stuff that we're getting from a database, sometimes these values might not be populated, especially when we're talking about modified date and modified time, modified by, because maybe the records, they haven't been modified period yet, and we want those to be null. We don't necessarily want to put values into the database that match the next two that we're going to talk about, which is a public string. And I don't make this one nullable because it's always going to be populated. And I do record by. And this is just, again, a convention that I've been using for a long time. And then public date time offset and record date. So those are pretty much the only ones that I do. What we can do now is we can decorate these two modified bys, and we can tell the database how big, what's the maximum size that it should reserve for each of these string columns. If we don't put anything, it's going to use the maximum length of the SQL Server like nvarchar or varchar, whichever one it's going to set up. I don't actually recall at the moment, but that's like 8,000 length. We know for sure that the names that we're storing here aren't going to be 8,000. We don't want to have to deal with the possible fragmentation on our database of setting these too big and having different things, allocated. So what we're just going to do is we're just going to set something reasonable right now. Again, these attributes that I'm typing, they're coming from the system.componentModel.data annotations. And when Entity Framework builds our database for the first time, or we do migrations and we make changes, it's gonna look at these attributes and say, oh, okay, go ahead and generate the SQL code that's gonna make a column here called ID, but let's also put the key on it and make it a key. And I believe because it's the only key here and because it's a number, the Entity Framework is going to detect that. And since we're using the SQL Server setup for it, it's going to go ahead and put an auto-incrementing ID on it. So when we insert the first record into the table, it's going to get 1. When we insert the second one into the table, it's going to get the number 2, and so on. Now you can't rely specifically on these IDs if you've added 3 records and somebody tries to add a record and you didn't catch the problem and you tried to insert it into the database via the code here or even on SQL Server itself. Well, that ID is going to be skipped and the next record's going to be 5 and the next record's going to be 6. So just keep in mind that even though it's going to be sequential, it's possible to have gaps in the numbering. Now, if you're doing a good job catching all the potential errors and you haven't ever messed up anything, your IDs will be 1-to-1. But I wouldn't rely on that ever happening. So there's always going to be something that comes up sometime. Now the date time offset, let's touch on that real quick. Now the date time offset is really just the date and time, but the offset is referring to time zones. So it's going to know that, and the web server for the most part is going to handle this based off the web server time. If you have users that are using different times, if they're from different time zones, normally between the browser and the call to the web API and the binding of those values that they passed in, the browser is going to pass in the time zone that the date and time were with, and the API, as long as you have your property in the model, the data that's being received as a date time offset, will be able to note that, and it will use their date time and their offset when it stores the data on the server. So the date time offset, I would recommend using it. There was some gotchas a little bit early on that I can recall, but I haven't had any issues with it when you're querying the SQL Server database, whether directly and in SQL Studio or Management Studio, etc. It's going to take your time zone into account into the query, and everything is going to work just fine. So I would definitely recommend it over the date time these days, especially if you have users in different time zones. You want them to see the stuff in their time zone instead of where the server is located. All those kinds of issues can kind of be addressed with it. So uh, next step, we wanted to go ahead and add, and again, I randomly picked 100 as the length here. I was just trying to bring it down from that 8,000. I can't think of an instance where I would have users logging in with usernames that are even close to 100, but feel free to lower it down to whatever you want to restrict it to. In addition to just saying that's how much space is available, it is going to actually provide a validation. Even if you don't catch it, that record is going to fail to insert, and it's going to tell you, hey, the whatever you tried to insert was bigger than this column's buffer, or whatever the message might be these days. So I'm just going to we'll just go halfway between it. So I'll do 50 on the modified by and on the record by. And again, I have the nullable set on the modified one, on both of the modified properties, and they're not set on both of the record date and the record by. Because one, I'm going to set up this record date to automatically populate whenever a record is inserted. Two, whenever a record is updated, I'm going to have it automatically populate this modified date. So this isn't something that somebody is typing in and we're getting it from them. This isn't something we're asking somebody for. This is just the system doing a little timekeeping and a little tracking on who's modifying and who's inserting new records. And again, once we get to the model building, once we get back to our database, we'll be okay there. So if you were following like me, you created this class for the base entity in the same file as you had created the class for food. Quite often while you're watching my videos, you'll probably see me do this. I just do it like this because I find it faster, and you'll see here is I'm going to hit control with the period or do the light bulb, and I'm just going to say move to type base entity.cs, and what it's going to do is create that file for me in the same folder that the class that I was just using was. And it just saves me a couple seconds coming over here, right clicking on the file, putting the namespace at the top. If it uses the data annotations or any other using statements that other one was using, it's going to go ahead and make that namespace available to us automatically. So it's just a shortcut that I use to get to this step. I would not recommend in any way that you are using one .cs file with multiple classes in it. I have never heard somebody make the argument that made sense to me about that. So if you're following my videos and you want to keep your code semi-clean, I would definitely recommend not adding tons of tables or just classes in general to one file. Okay. Now we have our food and we have our base entity, but that base entity, we don't plan on making that a table itself. The whole point of it was so we could come into our food entity, and as we have this food, now it's automatically going to inherit those 5 properties that we created, the ID and the names and the modified dates and stuff. So now we automatically have those. It's automatically that ID column is automatically going to be there. We're going to get that auto incrementing for it. And that auto incrementing, that ID is going to be how maybe other tables reference this food table, and we're going to get to those entities here shortly, but that ID is going to be how they're going to do it. And at least at the moment, we haven't defined any properties in our food. So let's just go ahead and do a public. Definitely not making a class. We're doing a string, and we're going to call it name. I'm just going to do a getter and setter. I think, I know for sure early on that these needed to be properties. They couldn't be fields. Maybe that's changed moving into these later versions of Entity Framework and stuff, but I believe fields is available in Reflection, so I'm not sure why it couldn't be, but just know that I'm doing all mine with get and set, and if you don't want to run into issues or have anything else going on like that, I recommend you go ahead and use the getters and setters until, maybe you just do a quick project and test that if it works, with fields or not now. I can't think of any other properties we want to add to this sample table for now, so I'm going to go ahead and save it. And I think that's it. Let's keep it simple with just one table for now. And go back to our tutorial context or whatever you called your database, your database name, context. And we'll go down to on model creating. And we're just going to do a couple of things. Normally, again, anytime I find myself, and I would be doing something like this for every single table. So I'll probably end up, if you're following the series more, with a different method where I'm going to go ahead and write some reusable code to do this. Okay, got too many alarms going on and off. We're on the model creating. Oh, so what we wanted to do was to add our table and add a little information about this table. So what we can do to tell Entity Framework a little bit more about it and what we want to happen, we'll do builder.entity, and for the type of entity we're going to do, we wanted to just write the name of that class that we made, so food in this instance. And I did control period, but you can of course click the light bulb. And now we'll do that. And what do we want to do with this entity? Well, I think in addition, because we already told it it had a key with the attributes. Now, if we hadn't told it with the attributes, we could do something like has key and put that there. Now, I try to limit how many times I'm coming into this model creating, and I think there is a way to do this, but for now, what we'll do is as obviously. Okay, so what we want to tell it is something about one of the properties of this table. And so what we're going to do is just do a little lambda here, and we'll do p, and let's name these something better so we're talking about the food table. These can be anything. This is just the name of a variable, and it's going to be related to the property that we set here. So this food is just an instance of this type basically. All right, what are we going to do with it? Well, one of the things that I told you we wanted to do was to set a record date. And so what we can do with that record date is we can, after we have the property, we can say value generated on add. And I like to write these on different lines, but obviously these can all be strung together on a single line. And what's the value generated? Well, it's going to have a default value SQL, and that's because I'm gonna pass in the SQL equivalent of what I want these to be. And with the date time offset, in order to get the date and time with the offset of right this moment of now, what you do is do sys date time offset, and that's how you would select the current time in T-SQL with the offset here. So that's the end of the first property changes that we wanted to make. If we had other property changes, I believe we could just string them along here and just keep doing it. We'll be doing these on different lines. What's the other thing that we wanted to auto-populate? The other thing we wanted to auto-populate was the modified. So I'm just going to copy and paste that block, and I'm going to type in the modified date. So now the property here is the modified date. Now we don't necessarily want to generate a modified date when this record is first inserted, or else, depending on how we look at the data, that might be confusing. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this value generated on, and we're going to change it to just update. Now, if you wanted to do it both on add and on update, there's also, the on add or update. But again, we're not using that, just know it's available. Okay, now obviously we can't populate anything by default for the record by or the modified by, because those are names that we're going to have to pass in at the time. So for now, those are just the two defaults that we're going to set. I believe that there is some attributes for setting those like this. That way, like how we did string length here, if we wanted to do the equivalent in the model builder, we would come over here. I'll just type it out instead of copying and pasting, but we'll do builder.entity. And again, we're talking about the food entity here. And what do we want to do with it? Well, we want to tell it something about one of the properties. And the property that we're referencing is the food.record by was one of them. And what do we want to tell it about that property? Well, it has something. Let's look down this list here and see. You can see here it has a max length. And so what would we do? We would go ahead and set that and say 50. And now that's the same as having that string length 50 for the modified one, in this case on the record by, and they're equivalent. Now we don't need to have them both, it's kind of duplicates, and I try to do most of it with the attributes, because going into this context, you could end up with a database with 100 plus tables, depending on how big the project is, and you don't want so much of that code in here that it just becomes a mess, or somebody could come in here and mess it up. I find the attributes just to be a little cleaner, a little easier to find when you're looking for them, and you can kind of just say, the food, yeah. And speaking of, we needed to come in here and we need to add the, I guess it's called string length now, string length, and we'll just bring in the data annotations. And how long were we making it? Well, let's just imagine that we can have favorite foods with up to 100 length. Okay, save all of our changes. Let's get rid of this. That was just for sample purposes. And we only have the one table. Now that's not all we need to do to tell our database that we've got this table in here. So what we need to do is I'll come above these constructors. You might prefer to put things below the constructors, but however you prefer here is fine. So how do we tell this database context that we've got tables it needs to know about? Well, in Entity Framework, we've got the DB set type. So in the DB set, it wants us to tell it what type. The type is food. Now, we're going to do public on these. Now, what's the next value that we need to punch in here? And that's going to be the name of the table. Now again, these can be changed down below in the model creating. You can set the table names there, but the way I do it is like this, and I say foods. So I always, unless it's just a real conflict with the naming, if I have a table of the type food, then I want the table in the database to be named foods, meaning it contains multiple food, which sounds weird to say, but we'll add a getter and setter on it. And that should be pretty much all we need to do. Depending on your version of .NET, maybe you're getting some complaints or warnings about these being nullable or not. If you're in Visual Studio or Writer and you're getting complaints that say that, hey, this is nullable, what's going on here, you haven't provided a value, well, you're going to need to provide a value Now again, if you want that warning to go away and you actually don't expect it to be null and you didn't want to put the nullable, maybe you should, just do this instead. But just out of a habit, because of the way I ended up learning this, initially, is I do the db set foods, and then I just tell the compiler warning to shut up. I know what I'm doing with the nulls here. So test it out both ways. If it works with the question mark, I just want to go ahead and go through the tutorial with the way that I know works, and we're not going to have any issues. But I would recommend testing that out and putting the question mark there instead of the null exclamation here. And if it works, go with that instead. So that would be the better way to do it. That way, code further down the line, knows that it's nullable, and you're going to get better IntelliSense from that kind of setup. Okay, now we've told it. We've got a database. It's called tutorial. Tutorial context is the class name, but the context is just the convention. It's just going to trim it down to tutorial when it actually creates well, it depends on our connection string, I guess, more. It's my convention, but I'm going to tell you where that's punched in a little bit here. Now, I don't think we need to set up our connection string just to do the migration, but it might make more sense to do them both at the same time. So let's go to our appsettings.development.json. Now, if you ended up not using the development environments and you have a different environment name, or you just want to do it into the main app settings, that's fine. I prefer to start out, especially with the database connections, I keep this local DB connection in the development one. You don't want to accidentally release something. You don't want to make a change in here for testing things and point it to your local one, and then you accidentally leave it, you check it into source control, and the next thing you know is it gets released, automatically, however you've got it set up, and you've got a website that doesn't work anymore. So don't put things in this appsettings.json unless it's for your production code. I would just recommend sticking with that for now. Now again, it's gonna give you a little bit more, maintenance issues potentially, because you're gonna have to, if you end up creating other environments like a staging environment or other environments, there's plenty of reasons to have different ones. But in those scenarios, again, you would need to come in here and copy those settings into the staging one and modify them. So just keep that in mind, is that we're working in the development app settings.development.json, and that's just gonna, for now, keep us from accidentally checking into source control things that potentially could get released, with the wrong connection string. Especially if you've got development code that can wipe a database out when it starts up with a fresh one. You just don't want these kinds of things happening. So, although I guess that wouldn't do anything to your production one, depending on your setup. So what do we need to do? We need to go ahead and do some connection strings. How are we going to do those? I have my own convention here. I think there's a different one that Microsoft normally sets up, or you might see in the tutorials. It really doesn't matter too much. We're going to tell it, what it needs to do. So I like to just do connections, and then I do the name of the database. I was about to write my normal one that I end up typing in. The one that we used here was called tutorial. So we're going to go with that. And then we have to actually define this data source. What's the connection string? How does it connect to our database? If you're going to follow this guide, we're going to use the local DB, which is like a SQL server that just is real local. It's kind of like SQL Server Express. And it's specifically made for scenarios like this, as far as I know. And we'll do local DB. I don't know if the caps matters here, so we'll just follow. Now, again, the slashes are terminators. There's really just one slash here in the actual connection string, but because we need to terminate that because it's a string that's going to get parsed out and stuff, we need to terminate it. And then we'll do ms SQL local db, which is the instance. So this is the server. We put local db. It's more or less like typing localhost or 127.0.0.1. Just, most of the time this is kind of just the cleanest way that I always end up writing it. It's just local db. That works perfect. The next part here is the instance of the local DB. So maybe you have, and depending on the versions of Entity Framework or versions of Visual Studio or everything else that you've used over the years, maybe you have multiple instances going. I think some of them say like local v13 or something like that. You should be okay to just use this one. I don't think it really matters too much. I don't know if it'll spin up a new instance. So if you have a problem here, go ahead and just Google connection strings and you'll end up seeing a couple of different ones. But I think that the local DB, the way I've got it shown here, should work for most installations. So, whoops, let me not cancel that out. Now from here on out, we're going to be using semicolons in between our keys and properties here. So the next thing we're going to type in is initial catalog, excuse me, and the initial catalog is the database name. So even though we punched in tutorial over here, we named our thing tutorial context, this is where we're actually setting the name of the database inside of SQL Server. And to me, it just makes sense to have the same name here. So we'll do the initial catalog. The next thing I end up doing is typing the application name. And for the application name, we'll just say that equals our tutorial Angular website. This really doesn't matter for anything. It's not going to hurt if you don't include it. But the reason to include it, and the reason I would recommend including it, is because all the connections to the SQL Server, and if you have SQL Management Studio or anything else, and you want to see the connections that are coming in, and it can be a mess if they're all just listed as SQL Server. What you want to do is you want to add this application name in, and then all the connections to that database that come from behind this connection string will have this as the application that made the request. So it will become a lot easier to find what's the open SQL Server processes that are running, or maybe something stuck or having performance issues. These kinds of little tiny things that you set one time will really help you later on. You won't have to go release a project to change this application name or go modify the settings to get it going. Just set it right now and forget it. Now you don't want to have typos like I just had. So the next property that we're going to set in here is the integrated security, and we're going to set that to SSPI. Now the integrated security is saying to use the security of the person that's running the website, not the person that's calling your API or something like that. This is if you have, let's just say, the website set up in IIS and it's running as, some sort of a, you can set it, what the process is going to run as. Maybe you have a specific username on your domain called websites. And again, I would recommend you have one username for this one website. But what this is saying is when we're developing and we're connecting to our local DB, to use the user that we're logged into this computer, well, the user that we ran this application as, which unless you do something, a little bit more complex, is going to be the user that we're logged into our computer with right now. And the user that we are logged into our computer with right now should have all the access we need for this local DB SQL Server instance to be able to create databases, to be able to remove tables and everything else. If you want to set up, and again, you can set up usernames and passwords in this connection string, but your connection strings are inside of this app settings file, and this app settings file is something that you're going to want to commit to source control. So instead of having to do things with your release pipeline that come in here and they change usernames and passwords for the production ones and other things like that, you don't want to have to worry about checking in usernames and passwords that you might not want to share with anybody else, even if they don't mean anything. You just don't want to do that kind of thing. So I would recommend, at least without getting into the secrets and all of that kind of stuff with .NET, I would say let's just stick with running them as the user that we're running our computer as. We won't have to check anything in that's sensitive. And if somebody gets the source code or they go and check it out from our public, source code that we've got on GitHub, it's just going to work because it's using the user that they're logged into their computer with. They haven't made any special SQL server users or anything like that. So it's just a best practice for security, and it just makes sense, especially for your development one. So we'll save that. I can't think of anything else we want to put in there right now. Let's just do, is there anything else we really need to set? I don't think so. Well, I guess we'll find out here real quickly if I forgot something. Let's just save the changes that we had made here. Nothing's ringing a bell that I missed. All right. So in order to, the first thing that we want to do is to tell .NET to create a migration file. Now, since this is the first time that we've done this, the migration file is basically, it's going to be all of the tables that we've defined, which is just the one food one in this instance. But it would be all of the tables. It would be creating the database. And let's go ahead and do that. So we'll do .NET space, and then we'll do EF, and that's for Entity Framework tool. And the next thing we're going to do is .NET EF migrations. And that's saying that what we're going to do is add or remove a migration. In this case, we're going to add one. And then we're going to name our migration. And again, this is going to be what takes, well, I'll show it to you. So we'll just add, and I'm just going to say initial. You can call these whatever you want. Normally, I try to have a name that kind of says a little bit about what I changed or added. To give me a general idea of what happened here. Unable to create an object tutorial context. Let's go here. And I had just clicked on the link to see what Google has to say about it. Oh, and of course, that makes sense. So what it's saying is that we didn't do any sort of the injection and stuff like that of our database context. So what we're going to do is just do it here for now. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it in here. Again, I've talked about creating like a startup helper and doing it there. I think that's the better way to go, but just to keep things a little simple and not to get too carried away, I think what we'll do is let's just go ahead and do the database context in here. So what we can do is services.add, sorry, we're in the builder, .services. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a database context. So add DB context. What's the type for that context? Well, that's, again, I type in my normal one there. It's the tutorial context. And if we do this, we should get an option to bring in that from the server or from the data tutorials. Okay, now let's finish writing this statement here. Now it wants a couple of things. We're going to pass in some options here. And again, this is just lambda. You can name options whatever you want. And we want to tell it the options is to use the SQL server. And we're probably going to need to import something here. So you can see we also need to be using the namespace Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And we'll do that. And now we've got some parameters we need to supply to this. So the first parameter, if we look, is options. Let's see what else we have here. We have one that takes a connection string, so let's work on that one first. Now, in order to read our configuration files, we actually need to load those in. So we'll do that in just a moment. But for now, let's just assume that, let's just make a variable that says configuration, and we'll just say it's of the type I configuration. And again, you can't do a variable out here like that. You should be able to. Oh. Again, I've got myself on JavaScript mode, so I'm doing things like that. But we're going to do I configuration, and we're just going to do configuration. We'll just say it equals null for now. That way we've got something that we're going to work with. So let's go back into our use SQL server, and what we need to do is say we're going to tell our configuration to get a value, and the value that we're getting is a string, so we're going to put that type there. And then what's the key for this value? Now instead of getting, instead of get value, you can do like get section, and that's fine to do too, but for this sample it's just going to be just as easy. So what is the value? Let's put these side by side, and let's actually do it with the development one, the right one. Okay, now we've got them side by side. The value that we need to get is going to be the namespace, basically, down the tree of this JSON that we have here. So the section is connections, and the key is tutorial. So you can see that this is the earliest item in our section here. But again, it could be under a different property. Maybe you have connections as your main section, but then you have a section called SQL. And now our tutorial is inside of that section. So how would we handle that? We'd have connections.sql.tutorial as the key that we're pulling out. And that's just going to save us a little bit. So instead of coming here and typing get section, connections, and then from that we type get section again, and we type SQL, and then we type just get value with tutorial, that's just a little bit messier to me than just erasing all of that and just typing get value with this little delimited namespace kind of convention here. So that's going to be the connection string that we set. Now in addition to that, we're going to go ahead and do some other options here. So we'll just say SQL options, and we can do what kind of options can we set in here? Let's take a peek. Oh, one of the things that I like to set for the project, and you'll want to do a little bit of reading about this, but for the most part, I think it's a good thing to have, is to split, to use the query splitting behavior. And what that does, and we have to go ahead and set what type of query splitting behavior, so we'll type query splitting behavior. You can see we've got two types here available. We've got single query and split query. So what that's talking about, and what that's referencing here is if we have tables that reference each other and maybe there's a lot of different nesting going on, and we want to pull properties, some columns out of this table, and we want to pull columns out of this table. Normally what's going to happen is Entity Framework is going to take a look at all that stuff that we want to get, and it's just going to write one big SQL statement that says to join all these tables together, based off the primary keys or the foreign reference keys that we've identified. And it's just going to build them all into one big query. So that can be good for just having, not as many different queries being executed. It's really going to depend on your environment. Microsoft and the Entity Framework developers, they default it to the single query behavior because I believe that's kind of the safest way to go. It's the way that people have been expecting Entity Framework to run for a very long time. I've actually liked this split query behavior, which is going to kind of take all those joins and kind of split them into different queries and try to optimize it a little bit that way. So there's some pros and cons to these behaviors. I would read up and see, especially if you're going to use this in a business environment with, let's just say a couple hundred users that are doing things at the same time, or maybe just really large data sets, lots amount of rows in your table, and there's lots of columns that are being pulled out. These are things that you need to analyze, and they actually can be set on a specific query basis. So if we're pulling that out and we want to go back to that single query just for this one section over here, we can set that up in the query that we're writing. So we'll get to that, here in a bit. I don't know if there's any other options we need to set. Let's go back out here. I'm going to go ahead and set a couple things. In order to set a couple things, we want to have those inside of the brackets here. So let's go ahead and do SQL options. And now, again, maybe we want to set the command timeout. So maybe if we're trying to query one of those big tables that I was talking about and it takes longer than, probably the default is something like 30 seconds. And if it takes longer than 30 seconds, what it's going to do is just go ahead and terminate that query and return back, probably to the API, some sort of error that said, hey, try again later, something like that. So enable retry on failure. There's lots of different options here. You can see that there's some batching options here. Migrations assembly. If you're running a really big project and you've got your data context in a different, maybe you have it like in a shared library or something like that, then that .NET, the EF migrations tools and stuff like that, they're not going to work for you because it's not going to be able to find those projects, at least not directly as part of this website here. So what you can do is you can say that to use the migrations assembly, and then you can just go ahead and type in the assembly name. So maybe you have another project that's called website.shared or something like that, and inside of that's where you put your portal context at. And you would just go ahead and do that here. That way, when it's writing the migrations and it's saving those files and it needs to get them later, it knows to look for the context inside of this migrations assembly for the tutorial context, which is the database context we're writing all this for. So obviously we don't have anything like that going on in our sample. I think there used to be some options that say, what kind of, maybe I can see it here. So we'll say options.use. Don't see it. You can see obviously here you can set a different logger. If you wanted to supply a custom one for all the logging that takes place inside of there. What I was looking for was something like use identity. I don't see it here. It might be in, I guess it would make more sense to be in the SQL options here, but I also didn't see it. Use identity. I'm not too sure. Maybe it's just the default now, or maybe I actually used to put that somewhere else. I believe the behavior I like these days is just kind of implied. It's just the default when it finds a single like integer, like number, base type, as the single key for your table. So I won't worry about that. Hopefully we don't have any more issues. Now again, the problem that we had when we tried to run the migrations last time was it was unable to create this context here. So what do we need to do? At least the first step is we needed to add this DB context. Now the way we've got it written, our configuration is null right now. So we need to get a configuration that's actually valid. And in order to do that, this is where we're going to finally deal with some of that development settings and the fallback that we've talked about plenty of times now. So what is our configuration going to be? Well, it's going to be a new configuration builder. And let's just go ahead and do that. Now, what are we going to do with this configuration builder? Well, we want to add a JSON file. And what's the path to our JSON file? The path to our JSON file is just appsettings.json. And again, we're listing these in the specific order so that it's going to load the first one up. But then when it loads, as we continue, let's just keep going. So we'll do optional, and we'll just say it's optional. And we didn't want that parenthesis there. And should it reload on changes? Let's go back so you can see this. And the property now we're filling out is to reload on change. And that's going to reload the website if the app settings are changed while it's currently running. I don't remember if it works like that for development or not. But for a production like release environment, if you went in there and you changed the connection string to the database to something else, it would restart the website and basically give us a new configuration. So we'll do reload on change, true. And that's it. Now, of course, you don't have to name these properties here like I did. You know, that's definitely unnecessary. Now, we're getting an error because, of course, at the end of this, it wants us to actually have an iConfiguration that we're passing back here, and that's not what we had until we actually call build on this. Now I've left a blank line in between here because we're going to add another JSON file now. And this is going to be the app settings. And I guess instead of hard coding it, well, we don't want to always be loading the development settings. So what we want to do is go ahead and do something like to get our environment name. You know, I can't think of that off the top of my head right this second. So we're just going to go ahead and type in development.json, and we're going to do true for the optional and true for the reload on change. And that's going to tell it that it doesn't always have to be there. It's not required. Now really for this app settings one, we're putting it as optional too because, you know, maybe you don't even have it, or it just depends on your development pipeline and how things are. But I would just recommend having them both here, having them both as optional. And if the files exist, they will be used. So first it's going to add the JSON file appsettings.json, and then it's going to load up the development one next. And if there's any properties that are in the app settings that are in both the app settings and the JSON, or both the development one, the second one that's loaded will replace the missing values in the first file. So it's going to kind of do some like object merging. And if a property only exists in appsettings.json, it'll keep it. If it exists in only appsettings.development.json, it'll keep it. If it exists in both of them, it's going to use the second one that we've got loaded up, whichever one's identified second. So now we've got a configuration, and you know, it's actually kind of bothering me. Let me see if we can't quickly see where to get the environment variables here. So builder.environment.environment name. That's what we were looking for. All right, so we're going to go back in here. We had it set up where we can do our string concatenation. You can see I just got the $ on the outside of the string quotes here. and that's going to enable this, special formatting here where we can throw this in there. Maybe you learn things. Let's do these side by side. We're done looking at this for now, so let's save that. Maybe you're used to looking at things like this, and you don't have the $sign here, but you end up doing like a quote to end your string, then maybe you do like a plus sign, and then you throw in your variable there, and then you have to go back and add another plus sign because you're going to concatenate some more string, and then you go ahead and do it like this. To me, especially as you start adding more and more strings into this kind of a concatenation, it becomes, hard to read at a glance. And to me, I can come up here and at least, now that I've looked at this stuff so many times, I just prefer I can read exactly, I know exactly what this is going to be, versus this being all broken apart. Just makes it a little harder to read for me, especially when you go into more and more lines. So we obviously don't want two of the same file trying to be loaded up there, so I'm going to get rid of the second one. Okay, so now if this was a staging environment or something like that, and we had a appsettings.staging.json, it's not going to try to also load the development one and the staging one, and the order of those won't matter. It's just going to say, hey, if I'm in my staging environment, try to load the staging app settings. If not, well, also in addition to, it's going to load that app settings.json up first and just replace the values like we had kind of gone over. And if we haven't messed anything else up, we're going to go back and we're going to do our second attempt at trying to create a migration. So I'm back in the terminal. I'm back in the folder for the website project, and I've got .NET EF migrations add, and I named this migration initial. So I'm going to try to run it again. You can see it started to build. It succeeded, and we've got another issue. And it's saying that it doesn't have a connection string. So we've got an issue here. We either are not reading the value or something else is happening. And how can we figure that out real quick? Well, you're troubleshooting with me and we're doing this on the fly. So let's do this. We'll do variable. We'll do connection string. And we're going to say it equals the configuration.get value that we had in here initially. And we'll come down here and we'll just replace what we had there before with this connection string. Since we have an environment all set up with, we can add breakpoints in, we're just going to go ahead and set a breakpoint on this add DB context line, and we'll hit F5 to start debugging our project. And very quickly here, after it does its build, we should hit our breakpoint, which we did. And let's just see what happened here. Oh, what happened here was, as I was explaining, and kind of demoing how you would do this nesting here, we did connections.sql, and we just have it as connections.tutorial. Let me make sure that's actually true. Well, it does look like it should have been available based off what I just saw, but let's try this one more time. It's possible that I had some sort of a typo up here, but we've still got our breakpoint set. We'll start running again. All right, we hit our breakpoint. And we still don't have a connection string here. So it's got two providers. They're both loading up JSON files. We can do this over here if that makes it easier for everybody. So I was hoping we would see our values in here. It's got connections. Oh, aha. I've lied to you guys in this video as well. So I mentioned that you were doing everything by convention with the periods. It's not periods. What it's looking for is a colon there. So between the sections and between the keys, you're going to do a colon, not a period. And if we were to go ahead and save it, I'm going to go ahead and remove the debugging breakpoint now because I'm pretty sure it's going to work, but that may be another lie. I don't want us to actually start debugging. Let's just go back to the terminal. And we'll go back. So I'm just going to hit the up arrow on my keyboard to get the last command that we had typed in. Again, that's .NET EF migrations add initial. And we're going to hit enter. And cross your fingers for me. I'm crossing mine for you. No, we still have some errors going on. So let's see what kind of errors we have going on here. Don't think that's related to what we're doing here. That's not related. That's not related. Let's do .NET build and see what I've done here, guys. Oh, okay. So what was happening was I had my debugging running, and you can't be running your debugger while you try to run these entity framework commands because they're trying to do a build of their own. So make sure you've got your debugger stopped. Don't be like me, and we'll run this command again. .NET EF migrations add initial. You can see that this time the build was a success, and also it actually completed, and we've got our migration created. So we'll go back to our folders, and now you'll see we actually have a folder that's called migrations, and it has this initial as well as this snapshot here. So let's take a peek at the initial. We're not going to go too much into it, but you can see that it's got an up method and it's got a down method. And what this is keeping track of is the versions of updates that we apply to our database. As we add more tables and as we modify columns and do these kinds of things, it needs to know how to go up a set of changes, and maybe then we want to undo that change, and it needs to go how to go back down. So in order to go up in this first initial migration, it knows that it needs to create the table. And what it did was, in order to know that it needed to create a table, was it connected to the SQL server, and there's a table in there called migration versions or something along those lines. I can't recall at the moment. But what it does is it has a record of all the migrations that have been applied to the database in it. And since it didn't find any at the moment, it knows that this is going to be the first time that this table has ever been part of the migrations that's part of the database. So it knows to create the table. If it had found a existing table in there, it might obviously not be saying to create the table, but to modify it. And maybe it's only got like one new property listed inside of it instead of all these properties. So just keep that in mind. That's how to go up. So you can see here it's listed like we expected the table's primary key to be a primary key named PK Foods, and it's going to be off the ID property. And if we were to have applied that migration and we wanted to go back down and reverse it, and to reverse your migration, you can see it told us right here and here. What we would do is we would type .NET EF migrations, and then we would type remove. And just typing remove means it's just going to go down one version to whatever it was last time before we did the commit. So I think it would be best to show you SQL Management Studio now, so I can verify with you guys that there's no database there at the moment. And after we run the next command, not this migration command, because the migration command just created this set of C# files that's going to keep track of how to go back up and down the versions like we've been talking about. The SQL Management Studio is taking just a minute to open. All right, there we are. Now let's see if I can share this on my screen for you guys. So I'm staring at a connection window right now, and I'll kind of walk you guys through that a little bit later, but for now I'm just going to connect to it. I'm going to tell this to look at my SQL Management Studio, and we've just got a couple of little test databases here. And what we can do is verify that there's no database here named tutorial at the moment. So that's all we really wanted to see. Each one of these is a database, and you can see I'm connected. The connection that I did, let me see if you guys will be able to see this window. No, it's not showing the pop-up window, but where it asks for the server name, you can see it's the local DB, MS SQL local DB, and that matches the server name and the instance that we put back in Visual Studio. So when you want to connect to your server and you want to look at this database, what you're actually trying to connect to is this right here. This is the server and the instance of the database. Now, you're not going to want to copy and paste it with the two slashes. You're just going to want to have one when you type yours in and connect to it, because, you know, again, this is escaping out the other slash. Okay, so again, we've got no database at the moment. How do we apply this migration to our database, and in this instance, create the database? So we're going to do .NET. Again, this is an EF command, entity framework. And what we're going to do is we're going to do database update. And if we run that, it's going to look at, maybe we have a couple of migrations pending. Maybe we did 4 or 5 migrations. It's going to run any of the pending migrations and just get us our database up to date as far as the latest migrations that we've made. And if we look at the snapshots, here we can just see the initial entity, or at least the way that it is right now. It's telling us the product version. Doesn't look like there's too much else in here. Don't see anything else. Again, this is just so it knows the properties, the max length. These are all the things that we had set by attributes or in the model builder. So, okay, our database update command had worked successfully. It says done. We'll flip back over to SQL Management Studio. And if we right click on our databases, if you've already got yours open, we're going to hit refresh. And now you can see we've got a brand new database here called tutorial. And if we expand that and we expand the tables, we've got that entity EF migrations history table I was telling you guys about. And if we go ahead and I'm going to edit that so we have the top 200 rows. And you can see here that the migration ID is the date time with the initial, and that matches up to the C# file name that was created. And it was created with 6.0.4 version of the entity framework. In addition to that table, we've got our foods table. And if we take a look at that, we've got some columns here. We've got the ID. You can see it set as the primary key, and it has the little key icon here. It's got a name column, the modified by date, record by date, and everything else here. So let's go ahead and just show that the default values that we had set have worked. Now, the only property we had in our food was the name. The rest of them came from our base entity. So what's the name of our foods? Let's just keep it simple, keep it Timmy, and say pizza. This isn't a modifying a record. We're going to go ahead and leave those blank for now. Now, the modified by record, the column value here, is required. If we try to save this record, we're going to actually get an error here, and we'll eat up ID number 1. So then the record will be 2, assuming everything works. So I don't want to have that happen to me at the moment. So we're just going to do the record by, and we're just going to put SB for small bang. Obviously, it's just any string that's 50, or what did we put? 50 or less characters. So Now for the record date, I'm not going to put anything there either because we told it that when we insert a new record, the record date should just automatically assume the value of right now. So I'm going to hit enter, which is going to take us to the next line and also save this record. Depending on the actual application that you're using to modify the data, maybe you have to commit the change or something like that. But I've tabbed down to the next line and you can see those values are still null, but we were put down on the next line, which meant that it was a success. And the reason why it's doing that is because maybe you have lots of records already here in this table when you did this. You might not want it to instantly start refreshing all of that data. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hit this execute SQL button here. We could close this down and open it back up again, but I'm just going to show you we can hit this execute SQL here, and that just refreshed the table. It didn't do anything, it just executed the query again. And I guess I'll just show you a little bit. You know, I don't want to make this a SQL tutorial here, but you can see that when we had right-clicked on foods and we hit edit top 200 rows, what it actually did was run this query here to select the top 200 rows, and it selected all of the columns from the table that we were looking at. And then this designer view just took that data and made it into a view where we can click around and actually type in here. So all we've done here is we've just re-executed the select statement, and we didn't actually apply anything, but you can see now that the ID column, it has the number 1 as we expected, and the record date automatically got something, and the modified date got something too, which I don't know if I had selected the wrong thing. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code and see what I've done here. I don't see anything here, so we'll go to the context, which is where we had identified all that, and generate on update modified date. So I don't know why we got a second one there, to be honest. I'll look into that. In a normal scenario, we shouldn't be seeing that here, and we should be allowed to have that as a null value still, so I'm just going to set it back for my own sanity here. So if I expand out the record date, you can see that today is 2022. It is apparently 4:20, and we did this at 9 a.m. And again, that's 9 a.m. Central Time. So we're doing the minus 500 or the minus 5 hours, for our date time zone. So we've got that available. I don't think I want to go into too much else on the SQL side of things at the moment. Just know that if we were to look at the properties for this ID, you can see as part of what got generated here, we should see something called identity. And if we look at identity, it's set to true. So by having that identity set to true, that's what's telling it each time it goes and inserts a new record, that it should increment the value by, and the default setting here is 1. So it was supposed to start with the number 1, and each time it goes up, it's going to go up by 1. Maybe you have some specific scenario where you need to leave some record IDs in between. I've seen certain like accounting systems and stuff do like this with like line numbers and stuff like that, where maybe they increment by 1,000 on each one, and that leaves room for inserting different line items in between them and stuff like that. So it really depends on your setup. I personally haven't written any code where I needed to do inserting of IDs like that, and I haven't ever found a real reason why that should be done. So I would just leave those at 1, but they could be modified should the need arise. And that's going to cover things for the SQL Server. I don't think we're going to dive too much into SQL in general here, unless we end up having to do some debugging or maybe setting some testing data up. But if you need to know more about that, I'm sure there's a bunch of videos out there, and definitely just leave a comment. I've got plenty of, I don't want to call it expertise, but I've got plenty of knowledge I can share about the SQL Server setup if we need to make a video specifically with some more SQL Server stuff. Okay, so we have a migration, we have a table. If we wanted to add another table to our database, what are we going to do? Well, we'd come in here, we do public. Again, I'm just using this class because it's just a lazy kind of step for me. But you can create a new file and do it that way. Again, it's going to be the base entity. It's called color. And we'll just make a property on this one called, we'll just call it favorite. This doesn't make as much sense, but at this time, I guess I could have showed you back on SQL Server, and I will pop over there real quick. When we were looking at our columns here, you can see that the name was 100, the modified by and the record by are both 50. Now they're nvarchar, which means that they're going to accept the extended ASCII things, like maybe you have users that are writing a enye in their name, or any of the special characters that some of these other languages use. When you're using the nvarchar, it's going to support those, but take up a little bit more size in the database when you're saving these records, because those bytes are a little bit more. So just keep that in mind, that the default is to use the nvarchar. That's going to support the most scenarios. Should you have an actual need, maybe you're talking with another database that doesn't use the nvarchar and you don't want to be converting data back and forth or having to check for that, maybe you would want to match those up here as well. I don't know if you can set those in Entity Framework here, but I would assume that there is a way to do it. And if you just do a little Googling, I'm sure you'll come across that. But just keep that in mind, is that it's given you those extended ASCII set, and it's just going to take up a little bit more database room. And the reason I thought of that was because we were doing, again, a string length. I'm just picking 100. You really do want to kind of fine-tune these numbers a little bit to be appropriate to the scenario that you're doing, and not just saying 100 for everything like we're kind of doing in this tutorial. You do want to limit these and make sure that they're going to be the right value, especially if you're enforcing the lengths and everything. But it's not just for that. It has to do with the performance of the SQL Server. If we come in here and we save a favorite color in the database and it has 25 of the 100, and then we come back to the table later and we update it to be a string that's 75, then the database actually might save that in a different spot in the database file, and you'll start to get fragmentation, and it's going to slow down how fast your database is being read back out of. So that's going to cause a lot more performance issues on you in the long run. Just try to get down to a decent size. You do want it to apply to the scenario. So if you set the food names to 100, make sure you're applying that as a validation on the user end, in addition to right before you push this data into the database, which we'll go over all that as well. So just keep them at a relatively small value as you can get it, and still have some room. If it's something that you might see yourself, you're not sure, what it should be, just start out a little bit bigger, and then you can always fine-tune the database later. So we made the color. We're going to make this a table. And again, I just wrote it in this file to be a little cheap, but we're going to move it now to its own file called color.cs. And now you can see we've got the file here. This is just complaining because it wants to either be told that it's nullable or be told, hey, I know that this is never going to be nullable. in our case, we haven't really identified or said that it's required. So I will go ahead and just indicate that it could potentially be null at the moment. That's fine. So we'll just go ahead and leave that like that. Leave that like that. It's the same thing going on over here. Most of the time I leave them the way that I'm writing them here, and I'll just put something in the rules to tell it. Let me just go ahead and see if I can demonstrate that with Visual Studio Code. Now, it's not giving me an option to do something like add a comment up here that says ignore this kind of a error, but we'll leave it alone. It's not a real error, and we'll move on. So we need to go to the database context now. And again, so now you can see already we've got this here, and this is not something that I'm going to want to write over and over and over. So how do we solve something like this? It shouldn't be too hard to write something that we can kind of reuse over and over and over here. So let's see if we can't just whip something up. We're just going to make this private because we're just going to be calling it from inside of this, and nothing else should be calling it. What do we need to do? We're going to set base entity defaults, and we need to accept the type. Now what we're going to call this pass in is the builder, and I think that's all we'll pass in. Don't need to do anything else at the moment. So let's take this down here, and we'll do this right here. And we're not going to do it on the food type anymore. We're going to do it on whatever type we pass into this. So we're going to do T, and we're going to do T, and we'll probably have to tell it that all of the T's are going to be of the base entity. So we're going to say where T is a base entity. Let me actually do that without typos. And that's going to let Entity Framework know, if you see here, that it accepts the type. And these properties, we wouldn't even know about them unless we told it that T, we wouldn't have any IntelliSense or even be able to do this, except for the fact that we said that the type T is a base entity here. So we can't pass in tables to this method that don't inherit from base entity, which is what we did here, but we don't plan on doing that anyway, and we could always create another one specific for that kind of table. So this is no longer food, and we're just going to call it entity. And entity, for as far as the entity framework is concerned, just means table, basically. We're just going to think about it like this is the table. And so we had two. We had the record by and we had the modify by, and we were setting those default values as the system, the date time now, equivalent in SQL. So that's going to be some reusable code for us. And now if we come up here, we can say set base entity defaults. And what's the type that we're doing? Well, let's put our food back in. So we need to have that. And we need to pass it to the builder, or we need to pass the builder to it, and then we'll just copy and paste that on a new line, and the new table that we made was called color. So let's do that, and now we should just be able to keep adding that over and over as we go down and make new tables. Now you could even up this and take it to another level and implement some reflection and find them all yourself, but we're going to do it this way, keep it clean. You need to kind of at least understand that there's something happening, and when you add a new table, you need to go ahead and call this method down here to set it up for the base default values. Now again, in order to really complete this, we need to say that there's a DB set, and it is going to be colors. And again, I just say equals null. And again, don't forget to put the exclamation at the end. And that's it. So if we go ahead, we go back to our terminal now, and I'm just hitting the up arrow to go back to the old commands. And instead of adding the migration name initial, now maybe we'll do one that said add colors. Now again, I just like to name these so I can see at a glance what are my migrations. You know, to me it's kind of like a commit message. I just do something real quick. You know, obviously you can't have spaces and different characters and things like that, but we'll just do add colors. We didn't really make any other changes that I can recall at the moment. So now we've made our migration. You can see we've got some new ones in here called add colors. And we're just going to go ahead and do the .NET EF database update now. And we'll run that. Perfect, our changes were applied. Now that last step that we just did where you do the .NET EF database update, that can definitely fail, and it will fail, especially in times where you've modified or removed some properties, or there's different changes you can make to these tables that it doesn't understand fully how to reconcile that change. So even though this .NET EF migrations was added, maybe you've got some foreign keys or you've got something special set up. Maybe you made changes to your database table outside of the migrations. There's a lot of reasons it can fail. It should give you a specific message, but if you're doing things in the code only, you're not modifying the database in the table, in the SQL Server itself, and you're not, skipping migrations or deleting migrations, it should work fairly good. So we modified the database. I'll show you just that we have been updated in SQL Server. Last time we refreshed it, we just had food, so I'm going to right click on tables, go to refresh, and now you can see we've got 2 tables in there. So, and if we look at the EF history table, and I go ahead and just hit this execute SQL, the little green play button, you can see it's got 2 migrations in there now. So if it was to go back, it knows that, hey, I'm going from add colors, and if I want to go back, I need to look at the code for the initial set. That's what's telling it the different order here. Nothing else that we need to talk about there. We've shown how to add them. I guess just for the sake of completeness, what we can do is we can remove a migration, and to do that we should just need to do .NET EF. I can't remember if there's a database command to do this first. I think it's just the migration. To be honest, I don't end up doing this. I haven't done it in a long time. But .NET EF migrations remove, and if we do that, you can see it's just starting a build again. Oh, and it says it's already been applied to the database. So there is a command to use to revert that. And let's just try .NET EF database, and let's just try a revert. Maybe we'll get lucky the first time. No, so revert is not a command. We can do .NET EF database help. And it looks like we have one to drop the database and updates to a specific migration. So it looks like if we were to come in here and we were to say database update initial, I don't know if this doesn't really seem like it's going to go back either, but maybe it will. I remember having specific commands to undo it, but it looks like it did run that command. Let's go back to our database on the SQL Server view, and if we were to refresh this and go to tables, you can see perfect. We don't have the colors there anymore. We went back, we reverted all the way back to the initial one. So it looks like you can do a name and actually skip, and reverse a couple of migrations at a time to go back. So if we were to look at the history table now, you can see that the initial one is the last one left. All right. Now I'm going to redo our change one more time because I do want that table, at least for now. And we do still have the migration. We haven't actually removed the migration. We could remove it, but there's no real need to do that, just to redo it in 2 seconds to show you that it worked. So we'll do .NET EF, and we'll do database update. Now this time, because we want to go to the most recent one, we can just leave it, and we can leave the command alone at that. Or apparently we can even do to say we want to go to the add colors migration to update to that one. Maybe you had a couple pending and you want to do them one at a time or in some other random order for some reason. I can't imagine why. But if you wanted to do it by name, it looks like we can do it by name. And we'll wait for that to finish. And it says done. We go back to SQL Server for the last time. We refresh our tables, and we've got our colors back. And if we refresh this table, you can see we've got both of the migration IDs back in here. So we've gone over creating a new database, which I'm going to call context a lot. So we've got the tutorial context, and that just means the code reference to the database. I just call it database, or it can be a little confusing, but if I say tutorial context, that means the reference into the database. This is the object that we're creating that's going to relate to exactly one-to-one to the database. We've gone over how to create this base entity here so we can share columns that maybe need to be applied to every single table. It's just kind of cut down on some of the copying and pasting that goes on, and just kind of make sure people don't forget to add important columns. As you apply these columns to the database, they're going to be in the specific orders. So you can see that they're in the name, they're in the specific order that we created them in our class. This, if we were to modify this table and add another property, if we didn't drop this table out, what it would do was those new properties would be at the end here. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just, sometimes it's just if you can avoid something or you can make it cleaner and all happen at one time, just put the columns and set them up right the first time if you can. Try to put a little thought into your tables before you start migrating them into your database. You just maybe put a little time on paper and just really think about your database structure, because when we're talking relational databases, those are going to be tables that have references to other tables in them. Let's go ahead and set that up right now so we can kind of see how that would work. If we had we've got two tables that don't make a lot of sense to be connected together, but maybe what we'll say is in the food column, we want to assign a color to this food. So instead of coming in here and creating a public string color, something like this, what we would really want to do, again, just to take advantage of having this relational database, what we would actually do here is the first thing that we're going to do is do, again, a public int, and that's that we're picking an int here because our key inside of the base entity, this is the property name ID, which is an int here. So we want to match that up. And the convention that we're going to use for that is to do color ID get set. And that's going to tell it, based off the naming convention that we just did, that this is basically going to reference by the color ID. Now we have to add something else here. We're going to say that this is a foreign key. Let me bring in the component annotations there. And the foreign key is going to be a property called color here that we're going to create just now. So now we're going to have a public property called color, and we'll just call it color. The type is the side that really matters there, I believe. I always name them exactly the same. So Now in our food, if we were to reference the food, and we haven't done that yet, so what we can do is we'll go to, don't want to get too sidetracked here, but again, this is going to create a reference to the color table inside the food table. So let's do a migration real quick. We shouldn't have to modify anything else. .NET EF migrations add, and we're just going to say color food ref. And again, the names don't really matter. You can call them ABC123. This is just going to be, you'll probably never look at these migrations or reference them by name too much. But we'll do .NET EF database update. And you can see that we've got a conflict here. What's the conflict? Foreign key, food colors. The conflict occurred in tutorial DB colors column ID. So let's take a peek real quick at why that might have happened. Let's go to our database, look at the colors, look at the ID. It's an int, that looks okay to me. PK colors, primary key, food, ID. So this is one of those times where I said when you need to modify a database and you've been doing it with migrations, it's better to have planned it out ahead of time. Now I will just show you a quick trip. Maybe you've gotten yourself into a bunch of trouble and you have no idea what to do with these migrations anymore. Because this is testing, this is our little testing environment, and further into this project here is we're going to have some code that can automatically seed our test data back into the database anytime that it's missing. So what I just want to show you real quick is that we can come in here and we can delete our tutorial database. Again, depending on whatever management tool you're using, you'll be doing it different ways. I just hit the delete key and told it to close any existing connection so it could successfully do that. So now we've got a database. Well, now we don't have a database, so no migrations were applied. And if we wanted to start from scratch, we could just delete this migrations folder. And again, this isn't necessarily the right thing to do, but this is something that's just going to kind of get you out of trouble early on. Let's look up actually what was the problem here. Onto food, add constraint with the delete cascade. I actually don't see why it didn't like that too much. Maybe we'll find out here in a second that we still have a problem and I'll have to actually figure it out. But for now, we're going to do .NET EF migrations, add, and I'm going back to the name initial just because, again, I know it's the first migration that we've got here since I deleted the other ones. Okay, we've got them. Migrations complete. We'll just do now our EF database update, which is going to create that database from scratch again since we deleted it. And now we've got our database here. If we refresh, here's our tutorial database. We've got a table. It's got the two tables, but if we refresh this migrations history, it's only got the one migration because those were both in the first migration now. And if we were to look here at the keys, you can say we've got PK colors, and inside of the foods, you can see that it still has the primary key foods, but now it also has a foreign key that's named foods, colors, color ID. And if we right click on that, and well, if we right click on our foods, open it up, which we already have here, and we just right click somewhere along here, we can go to properties, and I lied to you. What we actually need to do is go to the design. So right click on the table, go to design or your equivalent in your IDE, and you can see that there's a key here we're just going to right click on, I don't think it matters too much where we did it, but I'm doing it over here in this column. And if we select index and keys, we can actually look a little bit more about what's the index that was created along with the foreign key. And if we go to relationships, you'll see the actual relationship between the foods and the colors. So it's just got this auto-generated name, but if we expand out tables and column specification, and we click in here, so you can see now it says the primary key table is colors, and it's the ID column for it. Now the foreign key table is foods, which means that we're going to be getting colors from that table but using them inside of the foods table. And you can see that the ID column in the colors is going to tie to the color ID in the foods table. So that was kind of mapped in by convention in addition to the foreign key attribute that we set up here. Okay, got food. Now we need to actually consume some of this, maybe do something or read something out of the database. Again, later into this project, we're going to come up with some wrappers that do some of this work for us and make it a little easier, a little bit more friendly for testing. But for keeping it simple, we'll modify the existing web API and our weather forecast controller, or maybe whatever controller you have at this point. And what we'll do, I don't like referencing it directly like this, but let's just go ahead and do it. So what do we want? What got put into injection? Well, if you remember, if we go back to the program.cs real quick, you can see up here we told it to add the DB context service of tutorial context. So that's exactly how we're going to get it back out. All we need to do if we want a copy of it is to say tutorial context here. And then we'll call this our, let's keep it the same, tutorial context. What do we need to do? We need to add the using statement up here for the data tutorial, so it actually knows where this tutorial context is. And in addition to that, we're just going to do tutorial context. This is going to make it so it's available for more than just inside this block of code here. So we will save the tutorial context, and then I will create the field for it, which was just doing that right here. All right, now we can actually use it and do something with this database. Now this API, I guess this would have been a better sample to use, would be to make a little weather table and maybe select some records out of it. But for now, I'll just show you with a debugging breakpoint, I guess, or maybe there's something I can pull out of our colors and do something here, but we'll figure that out in a minute. So I don't think we need this test service anymore. If you created this test service, you can just go ahead and kind of remove the references to it real quick. It's perfectly fine to leave it. I just like to do a little cleanup along the way while I'm in these files. If you don't do it now, you'll never do it. So just go ahead and get it done. Now let's reference the tutorial context, or go ahead and do something with it. Now, maybe whenever this weather forecast API and this scenario, maybe whenever it gets called, we'll create a new database record and we'll insert it into the foods. All right. In order to do that, now let's do this a little cleaner so we can do something. But we'll do variable. Maybe we'll do our favorite food here. So again, we're going to do a new food, and we just need to bring in our schema. Okay. So now what we're saying is we're going to create a new record for the food table, which is that food entity we've created. And once we're done with it, we will add this favorite food to the database. And to finalize it, we're going to have to do a save changes on that. Now, we can't just obviously insert this blank food record into the database. We have a name we need to set. We have a record by that's required that has to be passed in here. So let's go ahead, and we have a color we need to pick. So let's go ahead and do for the name of our food. We already have one called pizza. We didn't set it up to be unique, so technically we could do pizza again, but we won't. And in this scenario, let's just do something like an apple. All right. For our record by, and normally I wouldn't recommend using the context directly in here, and I would recommend, and we'll go through replacing this, but just to keep it simple, we'll use the HTTP context. Actually, we don't have any authentication set up at the moment, so this actually won't return anything to us. And let's just type in a name manually. So I'll just type in small bang weather. So I just know that it came from there. We know the record day is going to be auto-populated. We know the ID is going to be auto-populated. The modified bys are just going to be left null. So what's the last thing we need to do? We need to go ahead and put a color in here. So all we don't need to actually, you can see that there's the color and there's the color ID. In order to just save a record, the only thing we need to actually populate is the color ID. The color is just going to be a reference to the other table that knows its columns and its values that are related. So what color IDs do we have? Well, we probably only have one color ID. I don't even think we have any anymore since we wiped the database. So let's make a favorite color here, and we'll just call it yellow. And our record by is just going to be, we'll just put, I think I've done a different thing every single time now. What else does it care about here? Oh, apparently it did not respect, or I did something wrong with our shared one. So I'm just going to do today's date and time. We'll just do 46. I'm not going to worry about the time zone. It'll just use my default one that I've got set up because of Windows, and it knows. Same thing. So now that's going to be ID 1. Actually, it's going to be ID 2 because we had an error with the first insert, but somehow modify date was fine. There's definitely got to be a typo or something that I've done there. But we'll go back to the Visual Studio Code for now, and we'll say our color ID is going to be 2. And that's going to be it. So that's going to be creating a new record and saving it to the table. And when we save the changes to our database context, it's been tracking if anything's been added to these records, and it's going to save that whole record. Now maybe after we save the changes, because we're going to step through here with the debugger, let's go ahead and get a value out. So before we save that record, we're going to get a value. And is there any current favorite food? I believe that table is empty now too because we had done it. So currently we don't have a favorite food at all. So this is going to be the first record in the database. So if we were to try to pull data out of the database first, how do we access the table? Well, it's pretty simple too. We're going to go to the tutorial context. And now inside of these properties, what we're going to have is actually one that's related to the table. So we'll have foods. And that's because we set up that DB set here with the name foods. So that's what we're actually using on this site out here. Now, how do we pull data back out? There's a lot of ways to get data back out, a lot of different commands and stuff like that. But for the most part, 90% of the time, you're just going to be using a command called where, and it says it doesn't exist at the moment, and that's because we need to do one more namespace, and that's system.link. And just by clicking that, you can see we've got that up here now, and that's going to make this where extension method available to us. Now we can't just pull data out into nothing, so we need a variable for this. So we'll say before adding record equals foods.where. We actually aren't gonna, normally I selected where because normally we would say where, and I guess we can specifically check for this. So again, with these lambda expressions, you might see me write like an O like this, or maybe I'll do an F for food, or maybe I'll write out the entire food. It's just a variable name that's in the scope of this lambda expression here, so you don't have to worry too much about it. I do O a lot. It's just because it's generic for me. It just means object to me. And normally I don't need to see the object name as the variable unless I'm starting to do a little bit more complex queries. But for the sake of just giving you guys and trying to enforce that you do things in a clean, readable way, we'll do. So what's the check that we want to do? Well, we want to see if the food.name equals, and equals because we're doing this comparison here. If you write an equal sign, just one of them, you're going to get a different issue going on. So we're going to compare the food.name to apple. And because we haven't saved any records to the database yet, we're going to get nothing back out. Now, we could just run this, but I have a habit of putting toList or toList async at the end of all these queries if it's at a point where I'm going to pull the data back out. The difference between having this here and not having it here is if you don't have the toList here, it's not actually going to go to the database and get the code until some code is executed that needs that data back out. So as we've written it right now, because nothing actually is trying to read the property, to read the getter for this property here, for this before adding record, what's going to happen is this SQL query would actually never get executed. Now, if I set a breakpoint in here and I try to evaluate this property here, it will, give me an option to go ahead and say to run the SQL query, if you want to read these values back out. So it's just something to keep in mind. You don't have to do toList here. Maybe we wanted to just make a query and it was going to be complicated. Maybe we could do something like this. We could do var query equals food dot, where the name equals apple. And maybe we wanted to add something else to that and say like query equals query dot where. And if we added another where statement here, so maybe where the food food.id is less than 10, you can chain these queries onto each other over and over and over and get exactly what you need. What is it hating here? It's probably just hating this next line of code at the moment. So we'll do var data equals, and then we'll do query.toList. So normally there's no reason to really break apart these queries, but maybe you're in a situation where your API has some values coming in and you only want to add this where statement if something else is happened. Maybe they passed in some flag that's true or false, and you want to say if that flag that they passed in, not that, gotta love the IntelliSense sometimes. You just want to say if that flag equals true, or if flag, the shorthand for it, then to add to this query. And it would only add the if the food is less than ID 10 in that specific situation. So why can't you just put the toList here and then add the where statement onto that list? Because if you've got experience with lists, you know that that's something that you can do. The reason you don't want to do it is because the moment you wrote this toList here, it went to the data, well, not the moment you wrote it, but the moment it ran it, it went to the database and grabbed the data. And if that data is more than the data we actually want in the end, we don't want to bring all those records from the database into memory that match just the food name equals apple, which isn't much at the moment. But depending on your queries, that could be a lot of data coming in from the database that then it's going to evaluate and do the rest of the queries that you have here in memory. Now we can't use the same query name at this point, but what we would say was we'll say var initial data, and then we would just say something like initial data equals, and then we add this, this part onto it. And again, because it's a list, we'd have to do another toList on it, and so on down your queries, and you just don't want to be in a place where you end up pooling lots of this data down into the memory on your web server over and over. So try to keep that in mind. Don't call toList, until you actually are at the end of your query building. So, maybe naming yours something like query builder. If you're going to be doing it broken apart, might make more sense, might be more readable for you. In that case, we just do this. We've got these query builders going back and forth, and at the end, we're going to put that query builder, that query that we built, we're going to say that needs to go toList, and at that point, it will execute all of this as one statement, assuming we don't have the code splitting going on and we don't have a complex statement. But for the most part, it's just it'll take all those and run those as one SQL query. So I'll go ahead and erase that flag for now. I'll erase all this query builder stuff, and we will leave the extra parameter in there just for the fun of it. But you can see that normally what you're going to end up doing is just chaining these commands like this. Now, if you want to include data from a reference table, the way that you do that is to use .include. And when you write .include, we can then say, again, IntelliSense in my stuff, we can then say, let's see if we need to do another reference there, bring in another namespace. And you can see I'm already back to doing O, but let's go ahead and do I for include. And what do we want to include? Well, it's showing us the properties that we have. The only one that's actually a reference is color. And so we want to include color. And what that's saying is, every time we pull this foods here, well, not every time, but in this particular query, we wanted to go ahead and include the data that ties to the color table and not just have the color ID. So this would be when we write our code, let's just say we're down here. So let's say we're looking at the first record of data. So I'm just going to say first record, and the first record of the data equals the data dot first or default. That's normally the one I pick. And then I normally just put a null check up here. Just say if first record equals null. Maybe you're going to throw some exception or do something along those lines. For now, just because I don't want to worry about well, we definitely will have to worry about the null because we don't have any records in here at this time. So we'll just say if the record is not equal to null, then we'll go ahead and come in here and I'll set some breakpoints in here and we're going to look at the data. So we'll just say var food name equals first record dot name, and that was always available even without the include. But if we wanted to do color name, and we say we're looking at the first record and we're taking that color reference table and we want to get the name out of that, I don't know, I guess, what did we call it? Favorite? We called it favorite. So if we had the favorite, man, I really don't like that name anymore, but if we have the color name property down here, this would give us a null reference exception if we hadn't done the include up here. So keep that in mind. Normally it's going to try to not bring in all those references, especially if it doesn't know that you need them. Now, most of the time, I don't necessarily select this data out directly like this. I don't want to go too much into it at the moment, but normally I would have another model of data that is just a class with some more properties on it that's a limited set or maybe a combination of the two tables with their properties in it. But for now, just to show you the functionality, we can do it perfectly fine with dynamics. And in order to select out just some specific data already in a specific type, what we can do is we can just say, again, I'll just use food for this, but we can do new. And again, because I don't have another model or class set up already, normally what you would do is you would new up one of those. So if you had a class called, food color result, as if that was some sort of an API result that somebody had asked for, you would do it like that. But for now, .NET has no problems working with these dynamics and translating them over to the database for us, as we would expect. So if you're not familiar with dynamics, you'll kind of see a little bit about what it can do for us here in just a moment. So since we're newing up a dynamic object, what we have to do is we're going to just create some properties on it real quick. So I'll just do the ones that we had selected down there. So we'll say food name equals food.name. And let's go ahead and do this in the proper case here. And the next property that we want is, what were we doing? Color name equals, and we'll just say food dot color dot, I guess it was called favorite. And this isn't nullable. So we'll do food.color.favorite. And I guess we'll call it food favorite color. So again, if I had a different class that had these properties already defined, we would new that one up and then populate them the same way that we're doing here. Now, we're not going to need this anymore because now what you see is it's saying that these properties don't even exist anymore, because we're no longer actually pulling out a type of food, but now we're pulling out a type that's dynamic that it knows just has these two properties on it. So obviously there's no reason to put these into different properties anymore, but just for the sake of showing you, we now have these two variables instead. And in the way that we just wrote it, we're no longer doing some sort of a table reference to another table to another table. We're not going to pull the data out that way. So at this point, we don't need the include, because what SQL Server is going to do is automatically know that because we're asking for this food favorite color to be populated when we do our selection out, it's gonna do the reference automatically if it exists and everything is valid. The other benefit to putting these select statements on your queries is that the other way that we were doing it before we added this select statement, when we just had it like this and we were doing the .to list without this middle section, is in every single scenario where this was happening, the database was sending us every single column in this table. And if we were to have done the include, and we were to include that color reference again, i.color, so we're bringing in that whole table's columns now too. So this is definitely something you don't want to get into the habit of just leaving these queries, especially where you have a lot of joins going on, returning all of your data back out to you. It's just going to be a huge waste of resources and a lot of work for the SQL Server, a lot of bandwidth between the SQL Server and the web server, especially if they're not running on the same machine. And then of course that's going to apply if we were to send these models or these entities directly down the API. That's a bunch of columns that they don't expect, they don't want, and stuff like that. So we do definitely want to be selecting our values out like this. And like I said, that's going to take the whole query that gets built and sent to the SQL Server and just say to select these two columns populated this way, and we don't have to specify the include anymore because it's already going to be handled in the select statement. So I definitely do a lot of stuff pulling, and we will in the future with optimizing how we can do some reusable code for a lot of this. But this is the meat and potatoes of pulling. So this is, pulling data out of the database. And this section of code here is pushing data to the database. And I think we can step through it at this point. Maybe the last thing we want to do, and this is kind of a good example of maybe why you didn't want to call toList directly on this query builder here. And that's because we're going to get the data and we're going to check it here. But at the same time, after we inserted our new record, I had mentioned that we were going to do it again. So instead of doing it again, what we can do is say data equals, we're just reusing the same variables up here, equals query builder.toList. And since our query builder is basically just a query, when we run the toList on it, it will go ahead and execute that query again. So what do we got? Query builder.toList, and then I'll just go ahead and I'll just set a breakpoint down here, and we'll just examine it at that point. So we got a breakpoint before we start entering the new data, which will let us look at, I guess, in here. And I think we should be able to go from here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hit F5 to start debugging. You can click on your play button or whatever the button is for you. And once my website shows up, we'll switch over to that. All right, there was a phone call. Hopefully I'll cut that out in editing. So we've got the browser pulled up, and nothing should have happened at this point. But if we go to the fetch data, which is going to call our API, we should hit some breakpoints here, which we did. Now, you can see that our first record, all that code finished running, and we didn't hit our breakpoint in first record because we said if the first record does not equal null, then to show us that stuff. But of course it is null because we don't have any records there yet. And if we go ahead and take a look at what's in the data, which is where we executed the toList on our query builder, you can see that it's an empty list at the moment. All right, that's as we expected. Now what we want to do is step through creating this new record and saving it to the database. So what we'll do there is I'll just set another breakpoint here. And you can see that everything executed fine. And if we switch over to SQL Server, we should now have a record in our database. I guess we already got that open. You can see we now have this apple. And you can see that the record by was this small bang-weather that I had kind of hard-coded up here. And again, we're going to have to look at the record date because it's definitely not populating with what I had expected there. But if we come down here and now we execute that query builder toList, that the first time data had nothing in it, and I step to our next breakpoint, you can see now if we look at the data that it did pull the food and the favorite color, and we have a list like this now. So there was no need to do any special includes to get the additional data. We have a very limited set of data. We only have the data that we want coming back and forth between the database now. And that is the basics of just pulling your data out and getting it back. Now, if you're in a asynchronous method, the toList method has an async version that's available that you can await. You would just await your query with the toList async and everything would be fine. But Well, there's no reason we can't implement this. This is the first call on the API. So what we can do here is say that it's returning an asynchronous task with the same return types in it as before. And at the moment, it's probably going to tell us, hey, you've got an asynchronous method, but you're not doing any asynchronous work in here. So if we were to come back to where I was just showing you, and we were to await our toList async method, you can see now we've got that warning that's gone away up here, and we've been able to do an await on our async method here. So if you're using async methods, I definitely recommend you go async all the way. You do it on your API, and then everything, all the code and the services that get called from then on, those are all going to be async as well, where it makes sense. And I would just continue going async all the way down the chain. You don't want to stop it early on, because then some code in another service that maybe somebody else wrote, or it's a library that you're calling, it is, a task. It's going to support this asynchronous, and you're going to end up in a situation where you're doing bad things to call that code. So if you don't know what asynchronous is, I would just say that when you're writing this code in C#, it is a very small footprint. It does put a little bit more on, it's going to be a little bit more taxing on the performance. And when I say a little bit, I mean a very tiny amount. We're talking milliseconds here. It's just not going to matter in 2022 or 2023 and beyond. We're not in the 80s anymore. We can afford a little bit of work on the processor to just get that benefit and just lay it out. Even if we don't need it now, let's just set it up. There's nothing really wrong with having this asynchronous task not do any code that's actually asynchronous. If we go back out here and we switch back to toList and we don't write anything like this, there may still be that small footprint that it's going to leave on the performance, but it's not going to do anything. It's just going to execute it as if it was not asynchronous, since there's nothing happening. And that doesn't hurt you at all. So I think we'll just go ahead and I'm just going to hit F5 to let that finish running and send the data back to the website, so it got its data back out. All right, I can't think of anything else I want to add into this specific tutorial section. If I missed something, hopefully I'll go ahead and update this video, or we can add it into a future video. Just leave me a comment and we'll address it. I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you in the next video.